Combs, who is 55 years old, could spend the rest of his life behind bars if convicted on sex trafficking and racketeering. He has pleaded not guilty.
She was a very credible witness.
And the judge in Sean Diddy Combs' sex trafficking trial finished Sean Diddy.
We're expected to hear from personal assistants and...
The courtroom fell silent as the judge uttered the words, "No one expected." Life behind bars, Diddy's face twisted with disbelief. But what led to this shocking moment? Witness testimonies, hidden evidence, and a defense strategy that unraveled at the worst possible time. Stay tuned as we reveal how Diddy went from music mogul to facing a life-altering verdict, and the explosive courtroom drama that left everyone
looking for his family. They've pretty much been at all of the hearings that I've been to, but there was no presence of his sons or his mother or his sister who had previously been at those hearings. So here's what came out of today's hearing. Number one, the government acknowledged that they offered Combs a plea deal. Combs acknowledged he has no interest in taking that. They're going to move forward with the trial. They also talked about the jury selection process, which one legal expert I spoke to said is probably the most important thing that you want to pay close attention to before the actual trial starts. And thirdly, we learned that Combs will be adding 2 new attorneys to his defense team.
We're expected to hear from personal assistants and chefs, things like that, to Diddy, and whether or not they are sort of victims as well as co-conspirators. That'll be maybe a fine line to draw, but certainly with information about drug use. Remember, we heard about that potential arson, obstruction of justice. Remember, those are more of the elements involved in this racketeering conspiracy that the government really hasn't gotten on the table yet, and I would expect...
It all began with something that at first seemed insignificant, a casual. Mentioned during a federal investigation into unrelated financial crimes buried in paperwork was a peculiar note about a lavish event hosted by none other than Shaw Diddy Combs. For most, his over-the-top parties were just another part of his flashy, public persona. But for a handful of investigators, the case took a subtle turn. That note referenced names, payments, and attendees that didn't quite add up, names that would later connect to charges far more serious than just tax discrepancies or financial irregularities. Diddy's public image since the 90s had been one of pure success. A hip-hop mogul, a forward-thinking producer, and an entrepreneur with an uncanny ability to dominate multiple industries at once. Yet these same traits, the boundless charisma that kept his empire alive, seemed to mask what investigators would later describe as something darker lurking beneath the surface. His infamous parties celebrated for their exclusivity and attended by the who's who of Hollywood. And music weren't just known for champagne and networking anymore. Whispers circulated among the entertainment insiders, murmurs that began to sound less like harmless gossip and more like breadcrumbs pointing toward larger systemic secrets. The first tangible cracks in the glossy empire came through as investigators uncovered digital communications, emails, texts, and financial transfers that seemed harmless on the surface. But when cross-checked with reports from paid informants, they began to show troubling patterns. Payments disguised as consulting fees raised eyebrows. They uncovered logistics pointing to a network that went far beyond simple gatherings, suggesting a system designed to move money, influence, and power quietly, efficiently. At first glance, it looked like it might just be about tax evasion, but those closest to the case couldn't ignore how these transactions lined up with certain names tied to organized activity. One particularly damning find was a ledger stored amid what was thought to be routine financial records. This document, straightforward in how it listed amounts and code names, made no direct reference to Diddy himself. But the coded transactions seemed curiously mapped to events and associates well. Within his sphere, slowly, these findings began to point investigators toward allegations that diverged wildly from the public image Diddy had spent decades building. When whispers of these connections began to reach insiders, some spoke out anonymously. At first, little by little, federal agents put the pieces together, linking testimony with evidence to uncover patterns suggesting deeper involvement. Finally, the tipping point came with a series of wiretapped conversations where casual mentions of settling loose ends hinted at criminal workings running parallel to his public activities. At this moment, federal agents made the call to establish a formal investigation. But this was just the beginning. What followed years later in the courtroom turned these long-buried whispers into explosive evidence that no one could ignore.
Yeah, Chanel, it's looking more and more like that testimony will not be thrown out. Obviously, last week was all about the star witness, Cassie Ventura, star victim, I should say. She's victim number 1 in that government indictment. But the testimony from Dawn Richard was meant to corroborate some of Cassie's abuse. And part of that corroboration was an incident that she testified about when Diddy actually, she alleged, hit Cassie with a skillet. She was making eggs. He got, enraged and hit her with a skillet. Now, she also testified that thereafter, Diddy told her that people who spoke about these types of things tend to disappear, and that she took that as a threat on her life. The defense attorneys, rightfully so, objected to a lot of this testimony, saying much of it was hearsay. In trials, there are very strict rules of evidence. The judge is concerned that a lot of these now corroborating witnesses may be veering into hearsay, gossip. You only want witnesses to testify, and they're only allowed to testify to things that they directly saw or heard. So that's part of this objection, as well as this statement that Diddy apparently made to her. We're already seeing the defense today really try to get into those inconsistencies in Richard's testimony about whether did she actually witness this abuse or did she just see perhaps the aftermath of it. So that's kind of the issue here. The issue is the scope of the testimony. It does seem that the judge is going to allow that testimony to stand on Friday, but going into more of this testimony today,
The trial began with a sense of spectacle, but no one could have predicted how quickly the courtroom would descend into chaos on one side. The prosecution came armed with years of evidence, volumes of financial records, wiretap transcripts, and a lineup of witnesses ready to testify on the other. Diddy's legal team, one of the most expensive and high-profile groups ever assembled, appeared confident, brushing off the allegations as baseless conspiracies fueled by envy of his success. But the courtroom dynamic shifted almost immediately, and each day seemed to chip away at the defense's composure. The prosecution opened by presenting a former associate of Diddy's, a man whose testimony painted an unsettling picture of what went on behind the scenes. He described events that weren't the glamorous celebrations the public saw, but something far more calculated. Allegedly, these gatherings were more than extravagant parties. They were cover-ups for illegal operations that funneled money through shadowy channels. As he spoke, jurors leaned forward, listening intently as he recounted specific details, late-night meetings, coded instructions, and payments made in cash-filled envelopes. The prosecution reinforced his claims by immediately cross-referencing them with physical evidence, including a series of transaction logs found in Diddy's inner circle. But what truly silenced the room was the testimony from a former employee who had worked closely with Diddy for years. She described her role in managing his daily affairs, booking meetings, arranging events, and unknowingly facilitating what would later become known as financial fraud and conspiracy. One particularly damning moment came when she recounted an instance where Diddy explicitly told her to clean up the books after a large transfer was flagged internally. Her voice cracked as she read dates and figures directly from official records documents that were later seized by federal agents. The courtroom reacted visibly. Gasps rippled through the gallery as the prosecution held up the actual ledger she referred to, pointing to a string of payments made to shell companies allegedly tied to an underground network operating under Diddy's name. The defense tried to strike this testimony as unreliable, but the employee's calm, detailed recollection left the jury with little doubt about her credibility. The trial wasn't just about numbers and transfers, though. Emotion poured into the room when a victim took the stand. Shaking but resolute, they described feeling trapped in a system they couldn't escape, one controlled by Diddy's financial and social influence. Their words hung heavy, and for the first time, members of Diddy's team avoided eye contact with the jury, their earlier confidence visibly faltering. It was a witness's offhand remark that sealed the most dramatic moment so far. They mentioned name someone not previously linked to the case, which raised immediate questions about just how many people were involved. Suddenly, the defense team scrambled, requesting time to recalibrate their strategy. From that point onward, the prosecution gained an undeniable upper hand, leaving courtroom spectators stunned about what still might come.
Defense is already acknowledging that this was a domestic violence relationship. The question is, can the prosecution prove that this was sex trafficking, that this was a RICO conspiracy? So you'll see witnesses this week like Cassie's mother, her best friend of over 17 years, corroborating this information about the abuse. Now, the defense is saying, all right, there were instances of abuse, but how is that relevant necessarily to forced fraud or coercion relating to sex trafficking? So that's kind of what the argument is here. The defense is saying these are just bad acts witnesses. We call them bad acts witnesses because traditionally that type of testimony is not allowed in trials when that specific conduct isn't being charged. He's not being charged with domestic violence or assault in this case. So that will be an issue coming up. But I think it's all about corroboration this week.
Lucien Grange has been a very powerful figure for a very long time. Started as with a totally different name, by the way. I don't trust,
you're the one that put me on that rabbit hole.
I don't trust men that change their names, least of all 3 times, okay? A family that goes from Goldstein to G to Grange doesn't make sense to me. And you have him at the top of the food chain, heavily implied by Little Rod that they were allowing this to go on to get blackmail on certain people, and they just disappear him.
And I mean,
what's the logic here?
It's
no
understandable.
Evidence. There's tapes. Little Rod said there's nothing but tapes.
Tapes of everything.
And that Diddy was taping the people that were coming as well.
Yeah.
When he's mentioned in a Little Rod lawsuit as the fixer, to show you how extreme what he's being accused of is essentially he's the guy you call if you shoot somebody.
Yeah.
He intimates this scene in the lawsuit, Little Rod, where Diddy allegedly and his son allegedly shoot some guy in a bathroom. Little Rod is as this guy is bleeding out, cleaning up, trying to help this guy. He's very close or just outside of the bathroom. Little Rod might have been in the bathroom. And he knows that after Diddy and his son come up and shoot this guy, he's trying to apply pressure to the wound. And they know that you have to call this guy, and he'll get the correct person over at LAPD to come over, and they'll tell a lie. And he says that the next day the press ran a story that there was a drive-by shooting, and he's like, that's not what happened at all. And it made me really think about the book Chaos that so many people on my podcast have listened to and watched. I mean, I have listened to, and it's describing a corrupt LAPD with feds that are involved and know how to disappear certain things. And we know that to be
Part of the trial. Diddy's defense team exuded confidence they brushed off the charges as exaggerated painting the prosecution's case. As a smear campaign aimed at tearing down a successful black entrepreneur, their strategy was clear discredit. The witnesses dismantled the allegations as circumstantial and centered Diddy's philanthropic efforts and clean public record for the first few days. It seemed like they were holding their ground. They pushed hard against the character of several witnesses, suggesting ulterior motives and even financial incentives for their testimonies in their opening statements. They cast Diddy as a larger-than-L life figure unfairly targeted because of his wealth and influence, but cracks began to form when the prosecution unveiled evidence that the defense had either underestimated or didn't see coming at all. The turning point came when the prosecution brought forward a surprise witness. This individual, a longtime insider from Diddy's business ventures, testified under oath about internal operations that they claimed were designed to hide illicit activity behind legitimate contracts. As the witness recounted incriminating details about the way funds were routed and accounted for, an audible shift could be felt in the room. The defense scrambled to object, questioning the reliability of the source, but the damage had already been done. What truly blindsided the defense, though, was the release of communications they hadn't been fully prepared to address. Text messages and emails subpoenaed late in the investigation highlighted conversations between key players in Diddy's team. One particular exchange was read aloud in court, a chilling reference to tying loose ends just before a key financial audit in 2018. The prosecution used this moment to argue that these weren't just sloppy mistakes in bookkeeping, they were deliberate efforts to conceal deeper wrongdoing. The defense initially tried to argue these messages were out of context, but their attempts to downplay the significance felt flat. Even the jury's body language seemed to shift as several members were seen taking detailed notes during these exchanges. The weight of Did's persona heavily hung over the proceedings as well. For years, his image was carefully controlled, extravagant but generous, flashy but visionary. But as the prosecution painted him as the orchestrator of a web of illegal activities, that persona became a liability. The lavish lifestyle that once seemed aspirational now worked against him, underscoring the prosecution's narrative of unchecked power and influenced jurors. Many of them unfamiliar with the inner workings of the entertainment industry were shown photos and videos from his infamous parties. It was hard to reconcile the billionaire mogul in designer suits with the mounting trail of evidence.